Hi everyone, I'm Ben. I'm the president of the Northwestern chapter of the Platypus Affiliated Society. This teach-in is titled Capital and History, Does Marxism Even Matter? And for anyone here who wasn't around when I gave my presentation on Platypus or is not on the listserv or something like that, feel free to talk to me after this discussion or this teach-in. And this teach-in is going to give an introductory survey, I suppose, of history, a Marxist, I suppose, sensibility of history, as well as the meaning of Marxism in the wake of perhaps changes in historical sensibility since the 19th century. But I'll say now that I have a tendency to overcomplicate my timelines, and I'm hoping that I will not do that. But as you see this line that I am drawing right now, please check me if there are too many events on it.
So this will not be only the writings of the Capital, then the critics of political economy.
No, so I'll get to that. But just to start, the ancient conception in which man always appears, in however narrowly national, religious, or political a definition, as the aim of production, seems very much more exalted than the modern world, in which production is the aim of man and wealth the aim of production. In fact, however, when the narrow bourgeois form has been peeled away, what is wealth if not the universality of needs, capacities, enjoyments, productive powers, etc., of individuals produced in universal exchange? What, if not the full development of human control over the forces of nature, those of his own nature, as well as those of so-called nature? What, if not the absolute elaboration of his creative dispositions, without any preconditions other than antecedent historical evolution, which makes the totality of this evolution, that is, the evolution of all human powers as such, unmeasured by any previously established yardstick, an end in itself? What is this if not a situation where man does not reproduce in any determined form, but produces his totality, where he does not seek to remain something formed by the past, but is in the absolute movement of becoming? In bourgeois political economy, and in the epoch of production to which it corresponds, this complete elaboration of what lies within man appears as the total alienation, the destruction of all fixed, one-sided purposes as the sacrifice of the end in itself to a wholly external compulsion. Hence, in one way, the childlike world of the ancients appears to be superior. And this is so, insofar as we seek for closed shape, form, and established limitation. The ancients provide a narrow satisfaction, whereas the modern world leaves us unsatisfied, or, where it appears to be satisfied with itself, is vulgar and mean. So I didn't write that. That was Karl Marx. I don't think I'm as eloquent. But that is an excerpt from the Grundrisse, which are notebooks that he wrote in the 1850s. And I would like to use it to frame the discussion I'm about to have right now. So this teach-in is titled Capital and History. And it is meant in a dual sense. On the one hand, it's raising the question of capital, previously applied human labor, the accumulation of wealth as a mechanism for social existence, and its unfolding in history. But it's also a bit of wordplay. It's raising a question of why do we put a capital H in history? What makes history, big H history, as something that matters to us, something that informs the way that we think about, act in the world? So when one says the 19th century discovered history, it's a bit of a peculiar thing to say. People have been historians for many, many years, but what's meant by it is the idea of history as a relationship. It's the idea that when we think about history, the events, the aggregated sensibilities, experiences of the past, that on the one hand, the past is something that compels us. There's something in history that ought to be, reconciled with, confronted, dealt with. And on the other hand, and this is very important, the present informs the past. What history is, the types of things that we choose to take out of history are conditioned by the conditions of the present, the social existence that we're brought into, and therefore the way that we read onto the past. And so capital H history, in a very simple sense, could be history as a grand narrative. History with telos. Telos being meaning or purpose, an end. That's what it literally means in Greek. And the point is that, on the one hand, it might be a teleology of the past. All past history has unfolded as it does because it was heading towards X, Y, Z. That's how the past is rationalized by the present. That is certainly one sense of the grand narrative, big H history. But something that's a little more peculiar and ought to be considered is a teleology of the present. What is the explanation for the present? What is the present for? i.e., what does the future, or a sense of the future, indicate for what we ought to do now? And of course, the first wrinkle in that is that our only sensibility we can get for the future is informed by our already brought up experience in the present, and therefore the past. So Hegel, funny name to raise, I suppose, says that history is progress in the consciousness of freedom. That the narrative of history is the realization of freedom, the free expression of human faculties, which is not a sort of formal definition of the meaning of freedom, but a useful one for us to use. If history is progress in the consciousness of freedom, the question is, where does freedom lie today? And I'm not going to answer that, but I'm just going to sort of put that in there to go to my next point. So Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, first chapter of the Communist Manifesto, first sentence, not of the preamble, but the first chapter proper. They say, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. Powerful phrase. The point is that something like that, it is utilizing the past to communicate some sort of task for the present. It's that history appears as the history of class struggle and therefore has to be overcome, redeemed in some way. It's not necessarily a positive or empirical statement. If you talk to any historian, there will be a lot of ways in which someone, they will insist, and perhaps rightly so, that, the principal relationship between, those in feudal society was not like serfs as a class and lords as a class. There was a lot more going on, of course. But the point is that when one reads the characteristics of feudal society as this sort of class struggle, the overcoming of a certain dynamic of oppression and the realization of a new mode of social existence, which is advanced beyond that, the unfolding of greater freedom, that it presents a task for the present which seems not to be free, quite yet. So it's a proposition on the tasks, the political tasks, namely, invoked by history. So that's the goal of this teaching, which is, if history is discovered in the 19th century, what else is I wouldn't call it discovered in the 19th century, but emergent? Capitalism, which is a proposition of its own, I suppose, but I'll get to that. And so what I want to clarify is the absolutely unique problem posed by capitalism historically, as well as the novelty of modernity as a whole, which extends a little further backwards, and I'll be characterizing it, terming it as bourgeois society. So where does Marxism fit in any of this? Because I really haven't said anything beyond just like a quote from the Communist Manifesto. Well, according to Marx's own self-admission, and I promise this is the last block quote I'll read for the presentation. Now, as to myself, no credit is due to me for discovering the existence of classes in modern society or the struggle between them. Long before me, bourgeois historians had described the historical development of this class struggle, and bourgeois economists the economic economy of the classes. What I did that was new was to prove, one, that the existence of classes is only bound up with particular historical phases in the development of production. Two, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. And 3, that this dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes into a classless society. So I'm going to put a little mark on here. That's the end of the timeline. And maybe suspiciously put 1848 to, let's say, 1851. And this is Marxism. This is Marxism in its where one needs to be a Marxist, I suppose. Where one, or in other words, one might not have needed to be a Marxist before 1848. Why that is, we'll get to it. So in this presentation, Marxism will seem absent for a while, and I encourage you as I go through this to think about why. How much is it that one needs Marxism for? Or rather, think about how much one does not need Marxism for. That is, things that people attribute to Marxism. Very commonly, this isn't some sort of very particular dispute between sectarians. It's just when people think about Marxism, how little of that is really novel. And therefore, as a result, how salient or particular or important what was sort of novel or unique about Marxism was, and why it might still be relevant. So I'm going to clarify the relevance of capital negatively. So if history is the unfolding of freedom, with a little wrinkle, capitalism, then the question is, or rather the way we might think about it, is the overcoming of forms of unfreedom. And so I'm going to talk about not bourgeois society quite yet, but traditional societies. Societies of antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the pre-Neolithic peoples. So this timeline will not be to scale because the first on the left is 10,000 BC, and this is the Neolithic Revolution, namely the discovery of agriculture in the sort of Central Asian river basins. And why I start the timeline here is because, in a meaningful sense, history starts here. Because this is the first time that people transition from a, can I ask, by the way, is this in the frame? Okay. A hunter-gatherer, or in other words, subsistence way of being to agricultural, namely the production of food, perhaps above and beyond what satisfies immediate needs, and therefore has a surplus. So what is the consequence of the surplus? It's that past activity informs present activity. Food that has been accumulated is now delegated, managed, and dealt with by people who did not collect that food. It is one of many ways in which humanity's activity changes, but I'm using the basic example of agriculture just to make a point that beyond just the idea of living and living informed by what your parents told you, there's a record which comes to be developed by nature of the fact that your activity is far more intimately informed, conditioned by what had come before you. And so this is the Neolithic Revolution. But there are a few things. On the one hand, humanity remains a totemic species. That is, it falls within the total dynamic of the natural world. An easier way to put it would be that humanity is still wholly dominated by nature. One is subordinate to it. They have not developed in ways which one characterizes as in control of the world, but rather they're controlled by the world. And this is manifested in society itself, namely that you have the polytheistic religions which animate all of these sort of natural forces, for example. And it can be as straightforward as natural spirits, or it could be the more abstracted gods of the Greek pantheon, although that's, I suppose, a little further down the line. But the point is that in a very useful way, religion communicates a sense that humanity is not the subject of its own activity. It is acted upon and reproduces its existence, but only in the service of something greater, whether that be a divinity or just the reproduction of the world as such. But importantly, and this tried out
Whose mark is yours?
I think it's this marker. Watch this.
Oh.
Watch this.
Traditional society.
Fucked up.
And traditional society could easily be characterized rather sort of broadly as societies of being. That is, the world continues as such. One lives to produce an outcome which was the same as they were born into. Tradition, culture actually is being in the sense that culture is something that you're brought into and is something that you're told is the way that things are. And to foreshadow it, you have modernity, which is characterized by becoming. We'll get back to that. So, pre-10,000 BCE, we have what in Marxism is sometimes called primitive communism, namely that there is freedom in a very meaningful sense. It's freedom with respect to other people. You're not dominated by one or another person. I suppose they can kill you, but you can kill them too. But you're subordinated wholly to the natural world. Humanity is not humanity as something distinct from what it belongs to, as in the sense that, one would not say that lions are any more or less free, or ants for that matter. Hunter-gatherers have no sense of development, and so their freedom is to be. After the Neolithic Revolution, and with traditional civilization, we have, and I suppose I can use the Marxist sort of modes of production here. We have ancient or slave societies, and we have feudal societies. These both belong to traditional society, right? And so I'll not put a date on it, but I'll just put, 1 AD. Precipice, the emergence of the Roman Republic. You have the Greeks before it. You have the Roman Empire after it. But you have antiquity. And what is the character of freedom here? Well, the obvious point is that there is a whole underclass of slaves. And in a certain sense, the mode of production is the slaves, or slavery, right? That the production and reproduction of the world of antiquity is on the basis of slavery. And it's not just that one thinks of these people as citizens who have been enslaved, but slaves and citizens in the polises of antiquity, poli, are completely different things. They're inconceivable as sort of reconcilable. The conquered and the conquerors are fundamentally distinct. And so in that sense, any freedom that is borne by the citizens of antiquity is something which is completely inaccessible, nor ought it be accessible to the conquered. So maybe just to draw an example of this, right? Have people here heard of Spartacus, the Spartacus uprising before? Spartacus and the Spartacus uprising is not a revolt against slavery. It's a revolt against their slavery, which is a very different thing. Because the point is that, and I can't say this with absolute confidence, but if I were to build a time machine and go back in time and learn the appropriate language, I could go to Spartacus and go, do you think that slavery should be abolished? And he would go, what the hell are you talking about? What do you mean can slavery be abolished? That's the way things are. I should not be a slave. I have been unjustly conquered, or I can assert my ability to conquer others and therefore prove myself. But slavery exists. That's the unfreedom. It's insofar as there are freedoms in antiquity, they're fundamentally limited. It's not human as such.
Aristotle prohibiting governors or those who govern from working is probably another good, from manual labor.
Also true, and that's something we will touch on as I continue in the teachings. That's a great thing to raise. And additionally, and this is something that's also important, which is a different character of unfreedom, namely freedom in antiquity is political freedom. There's the term, and I am going to apologize for my pronunciation, but the zoon politikon, which translates literally to political animal. This is what man is. Man is a political animal, namely that their freedom is freedom to participate in the polis, to conduct state affairs, and more importantly, that in the process of doing so, completely subordinate their private lives. That one's personal life, their activity as an individual, is completely subject to the collective, right? And so there's an unfreedom in the sense that one's choices are their choices insofar as they participate in the whole, but they're completely subordinate to the whole. There's no interplay of freedom, of perhaps the social and the individual. Additionally, you have feudal societies. I'll just mark this as 1000, although there are very good arguments to put it further back or further forward. So, on the one hand, slavery is far less prominent here. There have been, moderate improvements in the character of agricultural production. Society as a whole is very, very agricultural. This is something that's worth emphasizing because it's a point that I'll get on later, which is that for the vast majority of human history, very, very few people lived in towns. It was small settlements or pastoral, nomadic, whatever, but the vast, vast majority of people lived off the land in whatever shape or form, either as slaves or as peasants. It was agricultural, and it really cannot be stated enough. And in feudal society, the character of freedom changes. We have what we can call on the one hand, divine right, and additionally, the great chain of being. And the great chain of being is not just that, the God stands above the angels, who stands above the nobles, who stands above the, not nobles, the vassals and the serfs, right? It's not just like a hierarchy. It's a cosmology. It's a whole way of interpreting the world on the basis of just like what is just. It's not just that one is, told you're beneath this person, but it's that you belong to just, I suppose as straightforwardly as it can be put, a caste. You are born into a position which you will live in for the rest of your life. And it's a role that you serve, which is noble, no pun intended, insofar as it's fulfilling the function of the sort of cosmic whole. So you have God, the angels, the king, and the Pope, I suppose if you're Catholic, and you would be Catholic, in Europe at least. I will emphasize, I'm focusing on Europe here, and I'm happy to I suppose, defend that later in the discussion, but we'll, I suppose, get to why. And you have the subjects, the vassals and the serfs, but you also have the animals, the mammals, the worms, the insects, all the way down to the ground and the different types of minerals you live on. It's extraordinary, and the point is that this hierarchy is a way of interpreting the world, and these things are fundamentally distinct. And that distinction is a restraint. It's that one is, ascribed to their form of being for their whole life. It's different in the sense that caste has its respective freedom and the autonomy that falls within that. But it's a new form of unfreedom. Perhaps more or less advanced, we're talking from the standpoint of the present, but nonetheless. And there are obligations between them. So the noble or the baron or the lord of the land that you're a serf of is obligated to protect you. But on the other hand, and this is very important because it's the difference between feudal society and bourgeois society, it's not say that your rent is something that you have produced, your wheat crop, and that they take a portion of. Your rent is their wheat that you have produced and that you get to benefit from keeping a portion of, which is a very different thing, right? And so the point is not that, although it may appear from the present as expropriation, oppression, dominance for work that was not done by a lord, that there's a fundamentally different sensibility of how the world worked in feudal society. And so there's that. There is a very important fact, and maybe just to really emphasize the character of caste society. Caste society, societies of being as being indicative of traditional society, which is that unlike lots of contemporary popular media, it was functionally impossible for a serf to become a knight. This is a great example. You hear about it all the time in romantic literature, like the person who proves his goods and is able to, be recruited by the knight who's willing to give him a shot, and he rises up over the ranks.
Bootstraps.
Yeah, there's certainly a reason why that story is very popular, but it's also worth emphasizing that was just absolutely not the case. And the reason that I'm trying to emphasize these things is to characterize just how extraordinary of a historical break the move from traditional society to modernity is. And modernity is not capitalism, but the point is that the character of capitalism as an expression in a particular moment in modernity is a extremely unique thing and therefore poses unique problems. We'll get there. So in contrast to antiquity and feudal society, and I will somewhat provocatively just put 1492, I'm sure people who had their social studies classes know the mnemonic associated with it. This is the emergence of what we might call bourgeois society. Now, bourgeois, like the bourgeoisie, the property owners, certainly not everyone was a property owner in 1492, no. But, and this is where it is worth emphasizing the etymology of the term. Bourgeois, the first syllable, first syllable, bouge, right? Burger. Think about American cities. Pittsburgh, Harrisburg. It means town. What's bourgeois is someone who is a city dweller. It's the urbanization of societies. And just to clarify the sort of character of the difference, right? It's not simply that feudal society is transitioning into bourgeois society. It's that a completely new form of existence is coming into being from within feudal society. And a great way to, I suppose, I spelled that wrong. A great way to make that point is a German phrase which I can't remember, and so I'll translate it into English. City air sets you free. And it's not a metaphor. It's literally true. It was customary come sort of the 16th century, a little earlier, that quite literally, if a serf or someone indentured had escaped to a city and stayed there for a year and a day, they were free, literally. And so the point is that on the one hand, you have the emergence of a whole new form of existence. Why is it a new form of existence? Well, it's that people are no longer belonging to self-sustaining units. In antiquity, someone certainly doesn't produce everything for themselves, right? They might be a farmer, but they don't have all of their goods necessarily available to them. Tools, they don't cook. You have units that they belong to, and so in that sense, they might not think of themselves as an individual socially, right? I'm part of my family, I'm part of my town, I'm part of my tribe, whatever, or my village, I suppose, because I've been using town for bourgeois. But the point is that in city life, there emerges a division of labor. That there's, by the structure of urbanity itself, one is very clearly not realizing all of the needs of their life on their own. That you have to sell things to get other things. And that's not to say that one didn't sell things in antiquity, but if you were a peasant, for example, you would not very often be handling currency. If you were handling currency, you were buying very specific things. What is the tendency of bourgeois society? The universalization of exchange. Now, how does that relate to freedom? Well, with the expansion of towns and the universalization of exchange, there is a bourgeois revolution. But it's at the level of civil society. It's the way that society functions as a whole. Not the state. It's not a revolution in the sense of a political upheaval, but a change in the way of being. Or rather, the way of becoming. Sorry. The point is that society itself expands. In a certain sense, society emerges for the first time at all. That it may be that we might not even want to characterize traditional society as society, because there's no sense that there's something greater than the sum of its parts, whether it be the individuals aggregating themselves or the accumulation of capitals. On the other hand, and I'm not going to introduce the term class quite yet, you have humanity as such. How can you have humanity as such? Well, it's that one, on the one hand, is not obligated a priori to their family, their lord, or their occupation. That's not to say they don't have commitments to them, but that's not what governs their whole life, their whole existence. The nature of human activity becomes subject to transformation. So that's one way in which freedom is unfolding in modernity. On the other hand, you have the bourgeois revolution, the proper bourgeois revolution politically, which inaugurates bourgeois society into governance. So I'm going to put here 1789, and that is not to exclude 1776 from the unfolding of its history, but rather to clarify the acuteness of the political transformation. All things considered, the American Revolution was a very smooth revolution. It was on the one hand, among the educated and in a certain sense the more bourgeois sections of the American colonies, it was much less controversial. And on the other hand, I just don't have much time. So 1789, French Revolution. I'm going to give some context here around what leads into the French Revolution. So financing the American Revolution, actually, the French government drove itself into bankruptcy. Kind of ironic, but as a consequence, they have to call a completely archaic institution to basically figure out how the hell they're going to raise money, called the Estates General. Now, this is in 1787, I think. I might be off by 1 year or two. But the Estates General had not been called since 1614. So imagine that the United States was in some sort of deep political crisis, and they went all the way back to some crazy mechanism of deliberation that had been last used in the 1870s, and not since then.
Like the Constitutional Convention?
Yeah, a constitutional convention is perhaps equivalent in magnitude, although in a slightly different way, I suppose. But that's a good example. And so, what is the Estates General? What are the estates? You have the first estate, and I'm going to abbreviate it so I can write slightly faster. The second estate, and the third estate. The first estate is the clergy, those who pray. The second estate are the nobles, those who fight. And the third estate is everyone else. Perhaps I can say those who work. And each of them have equal say in the Estates General, which is a little weird, especially in the wake of the emergence of bourgeois society, where at the level not just of practical activity, but people's sensibilities about the world, work seems to do a lot. That seems to be a pretty major part of what brings about the present state of affairs. And in a certain sense, it's the emergence of capital, which is involved in that, right? It's that past activity, the accumulated wealth. And wealth, for someone like Adam Smith, the wealth of nations, is productivity. It's not just the stuff we've developed, but it's the things which we've appropriated in order to further appropriate, to expand human activity. And so with the division of labor, the expansion of productivity, and the seeming dissonance between the governance of a society by an institution which just presumes the state of affairs to be something completely different, it leads to a little bit of tension. So the third estate splits and forms the National Assembly. French Revolution follows. That is a whole teaching of its own. But the point is that the third estate understands itself to be society. Society is a revolt of the third estate. And so what constitutes the third estate? Universalism, cosmopolitanism, humanism. The idea is that in the process of laboring, in making your mark on the world and engaging with one another on the basis of your social activity, namely through your labor, exchange, affiliating with people on the basis of your work, buying things from others, going to the market, how are people rendered commensurable to one another? It seems rather obvious, but the point is that if freedom, or rather unfreedom historically, is marked by irreconcilable qualitative differences in ways of being, how can people be rendered similar? It's on the basis of their work. It's that your work can be rendered equivalent to someone else's work in some way. And so the relation to one another as humans is rendered possible on the basis of recognizing or sort of an emergent sense that society as such is constituted on the basis of work. And this is a consequence of the emergence of bourgeois society, urbanization, the development of towns. One thing I suppose forgot to mention is that towns, of course, exist historically. You have city-states and cities. But these are political or religious, much more so than they are cultural or commercial. So this is also sort of a characteristic change which marks the emergence of modernity. But so I've been talking about bourgeois society. Whatever, I've never heard of this term before. What about capitalism? Capitalism, which I'm going to put it at 1830. And that's not because one could not say that it wasn't any sooner, but because I'm going to situate capitalism with respect to the left. Capitalism is bourgeois society in crisis. So bourgeois society is an ethos of labor. The French Revolution inaugurates liberté, égalité, fraternité. Liberty, freedom, brotherhood, right?
Equality. You said liberty.
Sorry, liberty, freedom, liberty, equality, brotherhood. And it's not that capitalism marks a change in those things, but it represents a crisis in those things. So capitalism is inaugurated with the Industrial Revolution, which is sort of 1770s to 1810s. You can sort of mark the unfolding of the Industrial Revolution at that point. But when it enters into crisis is when we might think of capitalism as emerging. So what is this crisis? Capitalism, and it's sort of in the word, right? Capitalism is a society which comes to be dominated by capital. And that domination is not by people who employ capital. It's not just that your boss is getting meaner and meaner and controls more and more and suddenly you're like unfree again. That's not quite what it is. But rather, it's that capital, a relationship to the past through work, or the appropriation of the past for work, is suddenly something that we're not using for the expansion of human capacities, but which compels us that one has to work to live. So what does industrial production do? It does a few things. On the one hand, it renders labor increasingly superfluous. So for someone like Adam Smith, what is the point of wealth? Well, it's to expand human society as such. It's that you are able to increase the population. Population for Smith is sort of a proxy for wealth, because the idea is that you're sustaining more people. That's an inherent indication that society is more productive. On the other hand, in capitalism, not everyone needs to work to sustain people. But society is still predicated on work. You need to work to live. You have the emergence, not of wage labor. Wage labor has existed for a very long time, although what wage labor means is perhaps transformed. But you have universalized wage labor, that increasingly people do not own their own instruments of production, but that they're selling their time, their ability to work, to live. But not everyone needs to work to live. You have structural unemployment. Suddenly, the way that people participate in society is denied to them, not on the basis of some competing principle, but the fact that the principles governing their whole social existence are simply not able to be extended to them. And so this, in a certain sense, is where class society emerges for the first time. Class versus caste sorry, not because it's a qualitatively different mode of existence. People are operating on different, presumptions of what their role in society is, but rather it's sets of people who, within society, actually agree on the basis of what constitutes, the mechanisms by which they relate to one another, and yet they're not able to lay equal claim to it. There are classes, higher and lower classes, with respect to bourgeois society itself. And suddenly, this third estate separates into the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And so I put 1830 here because this is the first time that you have what you could really properly consider a workers' strike. In, I believe it's the Silesian silk workers' strike, but I could be off by a little bit. So at the beginning of this teach-in, I mentioned Hegel, that history is progress in the consciousness of freedom. Hegel dies a little before 1830. But the one thing he did write a little bit about with respect to capitalism was that there are these workers that are striking, and I'm not quite sure what to make of it. The point being that Enlightenment thought, bourgeois consciousness, is articulated in a time where it hasn't yet entered crisis. And so this is where Marxism comes into play. So the point is that the 19th century develops a consciousness of history. In a certain sense, it develops a consciousness of history only when it enters into crisis. It asks, what happened in the past now that the present is confused, And so where a society predicated on labor suddenly denies the ability to labor in it, and you have the emergence of class society, you have the emergence of struggles for socialism. Socialist thought is really emergent as early as 1789, but socialism proper is really a product of the early 1800s, 1810s, and the 1820s, the utopian socialists, and even into the 1830s, you have people like Robert Owen, who founds sort of like a socialist commune. You have the same thing kind of happening in the U.S., although it's not politically identical. And you have the Chartists in England who are pressuring for a change in government to better represent the workers. The point being that we're still not at Marx. So what the hell does Marx have to say about this? If the socialists are like, something's wrong here, and they have a consciousness of something being wrong in history, that the past is seeming to pose problems. And it's worth noting, right, that the socialists into the 1830s and 40s, how are they basing their political demands? They're holding up copies of The Wealth of Nations. They're Adam Smith is we have the right to our labor, the labor theory of value, the way that we're able to realize ourselves is through our work, and you're denying us work. And so there is a consciousness of history, and there's a movement for socialism, and it's on the basis of bourgeois values. And this is worth emphasizing, right? Just because the proletariat is denied, in a certain sense, the fullest realization of the promises of bourgeois society, it doesn't mean that the proletariat is not bourgeois, in the sense that their consciousness, their social existence is bourgeois in the same way that a boss would. You don't suddenly change your whole worldview in the most deep sense, right? So you might have changes in politics or preferences on certain things, but if someone suddenly becomes a boss, right, they're not going to be actually the world operates in a completely different way. Or just a more basic point is a proletariat can read an economics textbook and be yeah, even though those economics are denying them a job, which is crazy, right? So 1848. Why do I put 1848 here? And I'm getting close to the end of my presentation, actually almost perfectly near an hour, which is awesome. So the unfreedom of capitalism is being projected backwards into history. History is the history of class struggle. Going back to the Marx quote before, the second one, Marx says, "I did not discover classes or class struggle," which is important. And the point is that humanity is now being dominated by capital, a seemingly alien power, which is the product of their own activity, right? Capital is already executed work, past labor, is suddenly compelling people to work. The factories need to be running. The people need to be working, even though work is increasingly unnecessary as productivity increases with industrial production, right? This is why the Industrial Revolution inaugurates the crisis of capitalism, because suddenly we can produce way more than is necessary. You have the emergence of the struggle for socialism, and Marx is the critical consciousness of socialism. So I'm going to do one more little term here, and I'm going to write critique. And it's not the colloquial, everyday use of the term critique. It's more of the philosophical sense. So it's not, here's why something is bad. It's examination of possibilities for change. And I'm going to write the whole thing. So if Marx is expressing the critical consciousness of socialism, it is from the standpoint of the movement for socialism as it exists, what kind of possibilities for historical change is it expressing? Now this might be different from the demands that the socialists are making, because it could be that the demands that they're making are bringing about transformations, political forces, that produce outcomes completely different from what they expected. This is something that even Hegel talks about, right? World historic individuals who bring about massive changes in history, but in ways completely different from what they anticipated. That's fine. And so the point is, consciousness, in a certain sense, has to be different than that. Consciousness is a sense of what things are or how they're going. So maybe as an aside, right, if people have heard the term false consciousness in Marxism, it's false not in the sense that it's wrong, but that it is it's a necessary misrecognition. That false consciousness is a correct understanding of something or the way things are, but they're misrecognizing the possibilities latent within it. So false consciousness might be, just assimilation to the state of affairs. This is how things are, this is how they will be. That might be what we call bourgeois consciousness because, they really wouldn't want things to be any way else. And on the other hand, the consciousness which might be emergent through the struggle for socialism points beyond bourgeois society, but not on the basis of something different, right? It's the articulation, the pressing for these bourgeois demands, liberty, equality, fraternity, that somehow seem to not be reconcilable. So 1848. Massive wave of revolutions across Europe. France has the sort of like 10 series of like 10 different leaders, sometimes the same, namely Napoleon, who are constantly overthrowing each other between 1789 and 1848. Suddenly there's like a workers' revolution, right? Or really just like a popular revolution. The bourgeoisie, the workers, everyone is involved. It extends, it happens in Germany and various Eastern European countries. Although France is arguably the most successful, however you want to qualify success. And that's in February. And in July, I forget if it's June or July, I should know this. The workers suddenly revolt again, and they're completely quashed. So unlike the bourgeois revolutions, the inauguration of bourgeois society at the level of politics, success after success after success, suddenly the struggle for socialism exists, is certainly justified. I mean, I suppose you can argue whether it is or isn't, but I hope the teaching has warranted it and the people here are sympathetic enough. And yet it's failing. It's not succeeding. And so the point is that there's some sort of dissonance there. And there's a question of what is necessary to work through that, and what is it working towards? So just to go back to the quote, Marx says, what did I discover? That the existence of classes is bound up with particular historical phases in the development of production, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that this dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes and an end to a classless society. So capitalism, and I'm not coming up with this analogy, I'm drawing it from elsewhere, can be understood perhaps as something like pregnancy. That it's a crisis of bourgeois society insofar as capitalism has a nascent potentiality within it, but which is being denied by itself. That bourgeois society is unfolding into something, and yet bourgeois society is denying it. In 1789, where you could demand for liberty, freedom, and brotherhood, suddenly in 1848, you have liberty against equality. I said freedom again. Liberty, equality, and brotherhood. In 1848, you suddenly have liberty against equality. right? Think about contemporary politics. There's a party of freedom and there's a party of equality, and they seem irreconcilable. That's the crisis of capitalism. And the point isn't that one ought to opt for one or the other, but to recognize how that contradictory character points beyond something. That's what Marxism gets at. But I suppose to footnote the presentation, Marxism seems not to have panned out. That's maybe something that's worth emphasizing. You have, the Russian Revolution in 1917. The Russians try to stimulate revolutions in other European and non-European countries, and those fail, and then you have various revolutions throughout the 20th century. And yet, this image of possibility, right? A society whose character of relating to each other is completely different. So it's not just that the workers are in power, right? Because that's still a sensibility of bourgeois society, but something completely different. Something which we can't imagine because our ability to imagine is conditioned by our existence as such, seems to have disappeared from popular consciousness. People argue over their positions in capitalism. And so the subtitle of this teach-in, Does Marxism Even Matter?, is really raising the question of, what did Marxism have to offer? A critical consciousness, not of capitalism, but of the struggle for socialism, right? So he's socialism's most vehement critic, but critic in this sense. What does it mean when there's no struggle for socialism today? I don't know. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm happy to open it up to questions because I totally left a lot of doors open. But thank you. Okay, questions, clarifications? I'm happy to talk about any of this. Yeah.
I have questions, but I want other people to ask questions, but I do want to introduce myself.
Hi, Alan.
Yeah, because I'm Alan. I'm the treasurer. And I'm not the smart one, so don't ask me questions. Thank you. You guys go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Question and a snide comment.
Go for it.
I think it was George Steinmetz, but one of these historical sociologists was posing the question of what exactly is crisis when we use it. Because we use it so often now, where it feels like now we're in an ontological crisis. So I guess the question, if the crisis of capitalism, I obviously I know what you mean when you say that.
Do you? I don't mean that meanly, but
I think at least in that I do and I don't. I do in that there is a quantifiable increase in manufacturing or industrial violence strikes and whatnot, but I think that also denies the crisis of everything before 1830. I like how Emanuel Wallerstein qualifies all capitalism is historical capitalism. So I don't necessarily even disagree, but I guess what is your view of 1830 in history? Why is it so pivotal?
I'll touch on that and then I'll get to the sort of broader notion of what does it mean to be in crisis? Because that's also good. So why is 1830 capitalism? Because it's the first moment where the unfolding of bourgeois society has brought about really a symptomatic expression of a problem, right? That people are striking means that something is going wrong. I mean, just kind of straightforwardly, that if people are having to contest or demand, either employment or better wages or whatever, that it seems as though there's this antagonism, not between competing perspectives, but within the same perspective, right? That people ought to be able to work. So I excluded another very long block quote, which we read in Platypus, which is short but long for talking, which is by Max Horkheimer. It's an aphorism called The Little Man and the Philosophy of Freedom. And the thrust of it is that someone asks his friend for a job. And the guy says, well, I can't do anything for you. The laws of the economy don't let me. Well, why is that? It's not that he doesn't want to give him a job. I mean, I don't know, maybe they're not as good friends as they think, but let's just presume they are. it seems as though human activity has produced some sort of alien power that denies what people expect or what people want. So that's crisis. And by crisis, a better way to talk about it might be self-contradiction. Mm-hmm. So if I were to raise the question of what is Marxism, pretty simply, or I don't know, maybe it's not that simple. I'm going to draw a little thing here. So immanent dialectical critique of phenomena. If you are participating in Platypus, this is a pretty good shorthand for whenever someone says Marxism, what they mean. And what I mean by that is that Marxism is best understood as a method of interrogating an object of inquiry. It can be concrete, it can be theoretical. Even insofar as one is political, the Marxism lies in the way in which one is approaching the problem. So what does immanent with an A mean? It means from within. So it's not that you are posing something outside of and contrary to something, but you are taking up a standpoint and interrogating that standpoint through it. It doesn't have to be a standpoint, it can just be a thing, whatever. But I say standpoint because it's social, and so you're taking up society from the standpoint of society, namely bourgeois society. Dialectical, a little more loaded, but functionally it means self-contradiction. So I'll sort of brush out right now, very early in the year, the wrong definition of dialectics that almost everyone gives, which is thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's not Hegel, that's Fichte. And what it betrays of Hegelian dialectics is that the unfolding of something is not on the basis of just like competing things, but a tension within the thing itself. So self-contradiction. It's not that bourgeois society has these independent values which are abstractly completely discrete from one another and irreconcilable. They actually were reconcilable at one point and seem to have come into crisis. It's not that people just never realized that liberty and equality went against one another, but it's that the unfolding of society has suddenly pitted society's own principles against one another. There's a great line in, I believe it's the Class Struggles in France by Marx, where he says that bourgeois fanatics for order were shot down from their balconies by drunken soldiers. The point being that the maintenance of society even undermines the people who are calling for its preservation, right? That's where the crisis lies. The crisis is almost like a logical argument, as logical as Hegel gets, I suppose. Namely that it's in taking up something sort of independently of your own perspective, you're adopting something and saying that it seems to not really tie in a bow. And so critique we've already talked about, and phenomena is the expression of a thing. So the point is that capitalism is not just like classes, right? Capitalism is not the existence of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. It's a system of production predicated on the reproduction of value, of capital. The phenomenon, the symptom, the expression, which manifests as a result of the dynamics of capitalism, is the class struggle. The question might be, well, can you change the essence by working at the appearance? That's a good question, which I suppose I won't answer here as a pitch for the reading group. But the point is that it's the class struggle which might be the means of working through the problem of capitalism, but the problem of capitalism is deeper than that. I answered a little more than the crisis question, but I got at it in the process, so I hope that's helpful. Other questions? And yeah, Alan.
I was interested by your presentation before bourgeois society, of traditional society. Mm-hmm. Is the nature of change, or I guess evolution of traditional society different from modernity, as in the change from antiquity to feudal society, how does that work, or how does antiquity turn to feudal society, and doesn't need a revolution basically to
Mhm.
change from antiquity to feudal society, or is feudal society just like
Yeah.
a necessary like outcome of antiquity and like whatever is there at that time?
This is why, I believe you came in a little afterward, which is why I might reiterate it, that the emphasis on this teaching of capital in history with a capital H is that history is a narrative which informs the present. It's a mechanism by which we task ourselves. And so this history that's being presented is necessarily colored by the problematics of the present. If I go to, I don't know, like a lord in 1200 AD, and I'm like, you're like one step ahead of the Greeks as far as like the unfolding of freedom goes. You're like, what are you talking about? What is going on? And so the point is that the unfolding of antiquity to feudal society has whatever contingencies that lead to the sort of shift from conquest, enslavement to more stable political entities and sort of contracts that bind people to land. I wouldn't characterize it as a revolution, namely because there's really a conscious factor that's missing. These people are not sort of like, oh, time to like change society, And so really in a very meaningful sense, the bourgeois revolutions, both in civil society, the transformation of society, and politically at the level of the bourgeois revolutions, capital B, capital R, are really the first revolutions. But from the standpoint of the present, the idea that these are sort of discrete entities that represent different forms of class oppression is a metric by which we really gauge the unfreedom of the present. That the present seems to be a class society. And that all of history, insofar as all of history thus far has led to our class society, seems to have something kind of wrong with it, and that would need to be dealt with. That's also why one might say history is discovered in the 19th century rather than the 18th century, even though, for example, the Jacobins were extraordinarily obsessed with Greek and Rome. Because the point is that even though they model themselves on it, there isn't quite the same dynamism because there isn't really a consciousness of like a problematic of history. It's like a model, I suppose, or like a resource. In the same way that, if suddenly there was an astounding crisis in mathematics, I don't even know how to characterize it. Math has been in a crisis for a long time too, actually. But if something like apocal happened that changed math entirely, I don't know, maybe math was discovered in the 21st century. It's sort of a rhetorical point. But yeah, these transitions are sentiments used to clarify the present's relationship to the past. Not the same thing as an articulation you could give to those people, and they'd be like, yeah, absolutely. If you went to a serf and was like, you're living in a class society where you're the oppressed and the nobles and the king are oppressing you, they'd be like, no, I'm a Christian and I worship God and they give me my land, or not my land, they give me their land, and that's okay. Which is, that is how things are. And you have things like peasant revolts, right? But this is very important. That's not a transformation of the state of affairs. It's a reordering, a resolution of a misordering of the state of affairs. It's a difference between total versus within, I suppose. Not a great explanation, but did that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess I was trying to tie that into why 1492, I guess.
Oh, okay, yeah. So that's a good question, and it's also sort of an argument about contingency, but it raises a basic point, which is that there's a good argument for feudalism beginning in the 1200s and 1300s. I wrote 1000 just as an easy number, namely that the Black Plague severely curtails the population in England and the rest of Europe, and therefore labor, which they wouldn't think of it in those terms at that time, but labor becomes more scarce, and so you have to cultivate labor differently, and therefore you have feudalism versus just slavery or whatever sort of intermediary moments you have. 1492 suddenly opens up the whole world. Literally, I mean, you have the discovery of the Americas, And on the one hand, you have the conquest and the destruction. But something which I might want to emphasize is that the excesses of the exploration of the New World, the colonial projects, are the excesses and the violence are illegitimate on bourgeois society's own terms. Adam Smith, if you read The Wealth of Nations, talks about sort of the regrettable character of the Spaniards landing in Mexico because there was just this sort of astounding difference in technology that all but led to the destruction. And that it's immoral, but that what is the basis for rendering these peoples on the same terms? It's a universal society. And that's not the eradication of the peoples, but it's the integration into a means of relating to one another. And so what does 1492 do? It opens up a world where suddenly labor can like go somewhere and just build something from the ground up, like literally, right? And so that really is like fundamentally transformative for the situation in the unfolding of bourgeois society. That's not to say that bourgeois societies didn't exist before 1492, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, Machiavelli was alive earlier in the 1400s, right? So Machiavelli, Italian city-states, you can make your argument for bourgeois society starting in Italy, or earlier or later. But the point is that 1492 is a real epochal marker because it presents just like a whole new world, literally new world, capital N, capital W, to, and it's like a shock on the system. And so why I say that marks the beginning of modernity is because in a real way, it kind of poses concretely the question of like something can be different. It doesn't have to be that. It really is a heuristic to give this timeline, but yeah, I think that's what I'll say on that.
I feel like very similar, I'll be really quick, but the only other, I guess, development that I would add, and would just be land closings in England, and for the first time the use of convertible husbandry and the use of land for a means other than production to be directly eaten where it is. And that's not primary, there are debates as to whether that's a primary or secondary effect or whatnot, but it comes into existence for the first time, and for the first time you're like, wait, they're only making whatever they're making, they're only growing one crop there. Why? Yeah.
I would emphasize pretty emphatically that as I'm talking about the unfolding of bourgeois society, really the root of it is the emergence of the division of labor, the idea that one cannot rely on themselves or sort of like an intimate personal network. In bourgeois society, you live your life in a manner in which a substantial portion of, if not the majority of, your necessities come from people who you have never met. Just like straightforwardly. That's fundamentally different from the average person's life anywhere in history. And so it might come off as a little, strange or even kind of insulting, but when someone like Adam Smith says that the average laborer in England lives better than the African king, his point is that there's an expansion of needs, there's an expansion of access, there's an expansion of ease marked by a society of labor. So it's slightly polemical. But, so yeah, things like the enclosures, these sorts of things, are they causal? Are they expressive of an already existing force? I'd argue that's not really like a necessary point to defend the thesis. The point is that there's a clear break in the character of how society understands itself. Other questions? Yeah.
I feel like you mentioned this idea that one of the things that marked the capitalistic society we see today is the unique relationship between work and people. You mentioned how there has been like paid labor for so long, but then at one point on, it seems like although, for example, productivity keeps increasing, work is still compulsory. People have to work to live, and then you also call it like a society predicated on labor.
Mm-hmm.
I guess like what my question really is to have you like share more of your thoughts on why this relationship now is unique under capitalism.
Yeah.
I guess it has something to do with like Marx's like alienation theories, but I'm just like curious how you think about it.
Yeah. So there are a few things which, and I think I'm going to split your question into two, and I'll try articulating it just to make sure I get it. So the first question is, what makes wage labor unique in capitalism? And then additionally, it's just more broadly, what is unique about capitalism? Or is it really just the first?
I think I was like asking the first, but then if you're willing to share your thoughts in the second, I'll.
So why is it that wage labor is unique in capitalism? The easiest answer, and I think it covers a lot of ground, is that wage labor becomes universal. So it's working for a wage is actually very abnormal. Soldiers often had a stipend. Clerical work would, I suppose, sometimes get you money, but like the idea that you would like work for a wage and do that for your whole life was not actually the case. And at that, wage labor in capitalism is a sort of like infinitesimal reduction of your concrete role in the process of making any one thing. So it's not wage labor to do like artisanal work. It's wage labor to like pull the lever on a machine for 10 hours a day, right? And so on the one hand, wage labor becomes more banal. It's less fulfilling. Your human capacities are used for more animal functions, or increasingly animal functions. And then on the other hand, it's that wage labor becomes commodified like anything else. So in bourgeois society, right? So bourgeois society not yet in crisis, whatever that means. If you're working for a wage, it's either to accumulate enough wealth for yourself so that you can conduct your own labor independently. And you might employ your own wage labor at some point so that someone else might be able to do it. So today, right, there's a bit of an aversion, and certainly by the left, to like the idea of rights predicated on property, because not everyone can get property. Well, it wasn't that people thought, it wasn't that Adam Smith was like, actually, some people can't get property and that's fine. It was that a well-ordered society, Adam Smith is a moral philosopher, a well-ordered society is a society in which anyone is able to, aspire to property. The problem with capitalism is that that's not possible, because wage labor becomes solely the sale of one's time for in exchange for what covers bare subsistence, basically. And it's not just that your wages get worse, but the point is that the character of what you're selling is reduced to just like its absolute like essence, which is namely the time where you can work, and that it's that and only that, and that it's exchangeable for anything else as any other commodity. This is pretty important for Marx. So it's not a critique of like money or a critique of exploitation. It's actually the exact opposite, namely that what's so interesting about capitalism is that wage labor seems to be an equal exchange, and yet it reproduces capital, which dominates the proletariat. And so, why is wage labor unique in capitalism? It's because it's universal. It's because everyone is suddenly working for a wage. Not everyone can work for a wage. There's unemployment. This is why, in Marxism, there's all this talk about like the disintegration of like peripheral classes. So like, there's the feudal nobility, whatever. But also there's like the petty bourgeoisie. I don't know if you've heard this term. Those are like artisans, right? It's people who control their own means of production. It's not like a sociological point about like, these are a disappearing class because they like don't fit into the politics or whatever. It's that society actually functions better with industrialized production. You're competed out of the market. Not entirely. There's always a place for small-scale production, but it's that society renders people as wage laborers. The promise of freedom, the bourgeois sensibility toward freedom, subjects people to the greatest amount of unfreedom arguably possible within bourgeois society. I don't know if greatest is, maybe that's a bit superlative, but I think you get my point. Other questions?
No, you guys should ask if you have any.
So why? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate a bit on work being the ways in which people engage with their society?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the basic point is just that, like, people are engaged in social activity. On the one hand, we think social activity, we're like, I make friends with this person, I talk with them on a daily basis, I'm friendly. But that isn't like society per se. That could be, a tribe. Lions interact with each other, I suppose. I don't know why I keep going to lions, but it's. Anyway, so the point is that what constitutes society? Society is something greater than the sum of its parts. It's an existence, a mode of being which seems to offer more than just like myself as an individual. And also worth noting, the individual as a concept is a product of society. So there's a bit of an interplay going on there. But so why is it that people relate to each other in their work? Well, it's that they relate to each other socially, i.e. in society, through the interplay of their activity. If society is produced by work, by labor, right? And that the means of participating in society is through the acquisition of your necessities, right? This is why Adam Smith talks about, the free market. The idea is that a freely operating civil society, and it's not just that a civil society is the market, but that the market is sort of a primary mechanism of its activity. It allows for the greatest well-being of society. And I don't know, I'll be honest, I feel like I'm kind of tiptoeing around your question, so I'm going to try getting at it. It's that if one participates in society through their work, and one is asking the question, what is social activity? Well, what is social is the work. It's working in order to supplement the well-being of others, such that they also supplement your well-being. There's an interplay, but the interplay is through work. The way that people become maybe it's useful to think about this negatively. Not negatively as in like bad, but as in like a negative image, what it isn't.
Mm-hmm.
If people were not to relate to each other on their work, the question is, how might they relate to each other as people, socially, as equals? That's why I really wanted to emphasize the early point, or the early aspects of this timeline, namely that one really wouldn't think of themselves as belonging to humanity as such, because there are these other systems of organization which forward just these fundamental qualitative differences. So why is it that people are socially engaging through work? Because work, labor, is the first category, concept in history on which humanity as a universally applicable concept is conceivable. Does that answer your question? If it doesn't, I'd be happy to try.
I think it does. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I hate to keep interrupting, but if I could just add maybe a little definition of another way to think about it negatively could be social constraints on autonomous action. So in the 16th century, I guess in any century, you could refuse to work wage labor jobs, but in the 16th century, if you won't work a wage labor job, you'll just simply starve to death. It's, I think, just a new way of constrained actions, that doesn't answer the question of how. No, you go.
I don't know that. I think that you're on the right track. I don't know if I would mark that as the distinction.
Yeah.
The only reason is because, of course, we hear all the time that capitalism is worker starved. So perhaps that actually is representative of a crisis of capitalism in and of itself. But I think the more basic point is that if someone is a beggar in the 16th century, they actually choose to be a beggar. which is an important difference actually. So it's that you adopt a role that's sort of on the fringes of society, but it's not structural.
It's true. It's true.
And so the point is that the work you're doing prior to bourgeois society is really proscribed and therefore qualitatively distinct. So even if one is like an artisan, their artisanal work as a, shirt manufacturer is very different from that of a glassmaker. They'd be like, what the hell do you mean we're the same people?
Yeah.
Like they're artisans, but they belong to different guilds and they do different things. They still don't quite relate to each other on their work, even though they're workers. Bourgeois society, they relate to each other on the basis of their work because these antecedent forms, right? In a certain sense, it's material. In a certain sense, it's ideological. It's a little bit of both. I'd argue that the concrete shifts in the way that society operates leads to people thinking differently. But as these conceptions sort of fizzle away, it's like, well, how am I trading with you? How am I able to think of you as a peer? It's because we both work, we both labor. So it's not necessarily correct me if I'm wrong about trying to sort of read into where the confusion might have lied when you asked the question. When you say that people relate to each other through their work, it's not just that it's like, I made a table and you bought the table, and it's like I'm relating to you socially because I bought the table. The point is it's that if one is to act socially, the only means by which one can be social is by the sort of prior principle that you are peers, equivalents, on the basis that you both are workers. You both contribute to the same society. Very long-winded answer, I'm sorry.
So how can people realize that they are equal? Because I don't think for a long time there is a good association or union by labor, because it is easier sort of for bourgeois to form a society because they have been successful in their bourgeois revolution, and they themselves form the nation. But workers cannot realize their labor value unless they specialize in a category, so the division of labor, and that makes it more difficult and even impossible for them to realize themselves as a whole and their role as a whole, unless they can know everything. So how to reconcile this? And because they are specialized, it seems also impossible for them to rise up independently and to enter the stage of history development. And the case for socialist development and movements so far has not been independently done by workers themselves. And it is either through the modernization of the media of modernization is either through bourgeois class or through the state capitalism, as the Soviet example and now China. So how can it be possible to imagine a truly feasible way for workers to organize as a whole?
Yeah. So I would caution against one thing, which is allowing prematurely the trajectory of history, namely the failure of the left, to color color the possibilities that it conceived of and its activity before that failure. So, namely, the one example you raise is that the sort of trajectory of workers' movements has either been through the modernization of capitalism itself,
yes,
or state capitalism.
Yes.
And something like the leadership of a socialist political party was not understood as, by those people, right, as, hijacking the workers' movement for socialism or steering it in a way that they might disagree with. It's about elevating the consciousness of an already existing struggle for socialism to that which its historic role proscribes. So if Marxism is critical consciousness of the struggle for socialism, really, really important to emphasize that socialism exists before Marx, right? Socialist movements. What is understood as necessary for Marxism in the wake of the failure for socialism to accomplish anything on its own, i.e. 1848, is is in fact the necessity for something which is perhaps distinct from just like the workers in the struggle for socialism. That isn't to say that the workers are not, the engine of history. But maybe another important point, and this is something that I think is really emphatic in Platypus that's worth considering, is that Platypus, in its history of the left, has a left-centric approach to history. Namely that the ups and downs, the successes and failures of the 19th and 20th centuries are marked as successes and failures of the left. And so it's not simply that the seeming disintegration of a workers' movement for socialism has invalidated Marxism. It might have, it's an open question whether Marxism has any salience today or whether its object, a struggle for socialism, could really concretely reemerge. But the point is that how we've gotten to here is a product of the decisions, the successes and failures of the left, not simply of capitalism as this thing on its own. A great example is, and this is maybe steering off the topic a little bit of the teaching, but the concept of Bonapartism, which Marx uses interchangeably with imperialism, which is extremely important, is that the struggle for socialism, the proletarian workers' struggle, workers' discontents in France, are actually what stimulate transformations in capitalism. It's the necessity of meeting the accommodations that are given because the state has to concede or work with these socialist movements that force it to do more and more, absurd, bending over backwards, changes in institutions, these sorts of things to accommodate it. So it's not just that, the workers' struggle for socialism, failed to deal with, say, imperialism, but it's that the unfolding of imperialism is intimately intertwined with the struggle for socialism. And that's not to say that, imperialism is good because it connects with the struggle for socialism. That's not the point. The point is that crises in capitalism are like, I'm trying to think of like a good metaphor or an analogy, but it's that crises in capitalism are symptomatic of advances and regressions of the left. Because the left is the product of capitalism as a crisis. The struggle for socialism, the proletariat, is capitalism in a very meaningful way. And I don't mean that rhetorically, in a very literal sense, what reproduces capital? The proletariat. And the proletariat reproduces its own condition in its production of capital, because capital is what sort of compels it as an alien force. To get back to your question, what can be done is kind of an open question. What was done was, what did the best of Marxism do? It had union struggles, right? There were existing union struggles. There were these broad workers' movements that were not necessarily wholly assimilated to the party, right? This is something that's really a product of the 20th century. But rather there was an interplay. It was that the leadership of the most theoretically conscious was able to guide the workers' struggle. And what it offered was a sense that in the process of struggling with these things, you are only constituting yourself in capitalism. When you're demanding a better wage, you're competing as a commodity on a market, right? But the point is that in the process of that, what it reveals is the inability for simply that to amount to this sort of historic transformation. So you say that these workers' movements are at a disadvantage with respect to the bourgeoisie because they can't really constitute their own society.
Yeah.
Correct, absolutely correct. This is why Marxism is political. And contrary to, say, anarchism, which might advocate for building these sort of microcosmal alternative societies, on the one hand, we can't really think outside of bourgeois society. This is why I emphasized earlier that the proletariat is also bourgeois in a very meaningful sense. And then on the other hand, it's also just kind of a bad judgment politically. Like if you're trying to construct like a competing society, that on the one hand, that could just be like a political enemy depending on how antagonistic you are, and therefore you get crushed by world capitalism. Or you're no longer a market society is suddenly a new market that can be tapped into, and so it is subject to manifold forces that will try to reintegrate it into capitalism. Long way to say that Marxism is confronted by the need to struggle for state power. This is why Marx makes his second point in the quote I mentioned, that what is clarified by Marxism is the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's that we can't seem to think past society. Capitalism seems to be this fundamental structural problem. Really, the only way to deal with it is to put the proletariat in a position where it is responsible for society and has to deal with that shit. And it's not that the revolution and the acquisition of state power is the inauguration of something completely new. It's still capitalism. But the point is that the only way to get past capitalism would be to be in a position where you could actually really transform society. And that, for many reasons, which we'll get into in our reading group, so pitching that, has been assimilated into the state. And I don't know, I mean, the fact that the revolutions thus far seem to have entrenched rather than given some sort of way out of capitalism, that could be a reason, to dismiss Marxism. It's a proposition that Marxism might be able to do something other than that. Someone like Leon Trotsky, and this is a debate that he has with other people that are, that have affinities to him, has to debate over whether or not the USSR is a degenerated workers' state or state capitalism, which sounds just like, heckling over terms.
Yeah.
But it's actually really important for someone like Trotsky, because the point is, has the revolution failed or can it be recovered? And the answer is, maybe it has failed. But the point is that these judgments are being made by people who are saying, like, Marxism can have done something other than this. So the answer is, your question is a pretty salient judgment of the current state of things. And the question is, does Marxism maybe still hold something for us? And the answer is, people still seem to want to talk about Marxism. So that's what this teacher is for. Other questions?
Oh, no, you go ahead.
Just last question for me. I'm curious what you think about industrial policy as a means towards, or if you even have any thoughts about industrial policy as a means towards, more legitimate political struggle on behalf of the proletariat.
Would you mind just clarifying with an example?
For instance, let's say, I won't use the EU because we live in America, but if Trump enacts 10-15% tariffs and we see a sudden resurgence of American manufacturing, I think that is probably a good thing for the political sensibilities. It's easier to radicalize a manufacturing floor than it is, 50 remote workers. But at the same time, it is Trump's. It is industrial policy is, I think, especially today, is a reactionary right-wing course.
Yeah. So you're tapping into something interesting, and this is where. Earlier, before this teaching, in our interest meeting, where I was discussing the reading group and I raised the Frankfurt School, which, I suppose to the average person is like the on the syllabus. What is the Frankfurt School? It's the attempt to preserve Marxism in the wake of its disintegration, right? How can you think about politics when there's no political agent? And so what does someone like Max Horkheimer propose? And it's kind of coy. He has this essay, we read it on our syllabus, called State Capitalism. Actually, no, it's not state capitalism, it's the authoritarian state. State capitalism is by Pollock. But what is Horkheimer's point about the authoritarian state? In the wake of the failure of the revolution, perhaps even including the revolution, it seems as though all of the history, not just of capitalism, but history as a whole, has been the process of realizing the authoritarian state. That it's actually not the progress in the consciousness of freedom, it's progress in the strength of barbarism. He doesn't use that phrase, but just to make the point. And so what's the point? Because how can you read these things in completely different ways? Well, it's because Marxism is really less concerned about the what than it is with the whom. And so, yeah, maybe something like industrial policy could strengthen the position of the working class right now. But are there people who have the necessary political consciousness to direct that towards?
I mean, the only reason I thought of the idea was because Perry Anderson wrote in, I think it was LA Review of Books, a pretty lengthy article about, he's writing about the EU and the problems, he's writing for the need to blow up the euro. But I think he's really the only, and I've heard some rather fringe left-wing people mention it, but he's the only memorable name.
Yeah, well...
But then he's not even, he does not constitute political capitalism.
No. Well, this gets at a good point and an important point, which is useful for a definition of Marxism, and I'll get to your question. Which is that Marxism is better understood as a method than a position. Which is namely that, in the last 200 years, we're pushing 200 years on Marxism, it's crazy. Marxists have taken every position on every issue. And the point isn't just that some of them were right and some of them were wrong. Some of them probably were right, some of them probably were wrong. But that's not the point. The point is that really what could have unified them as Marxist was a shared affinity and a shared interest in political leadership over the struggle. And the question is, what sort of demands is that leadership making to legitimate its authority as sort of conscious leadership and to strengthen the working class struggle for socialism, to bring that struggle closer, ideally not further, from state power. Thank you. And so where that seems to have completely liquidated, a lot of what to do seems to be all that's left, which is why people are should we vote for the Democratic Party? Should we vote for the Republican Party? Should we support mask mandates? Should we
support Israel
who should we support in the Israel-Palestine conflict? These sort of things are the topics du jour of what is the Marxist position on it? And the point isn't that one can't have their perspective on it, but the question is what does Marxism have to say about it? What struggle for socialism is there to be critically conscious of in any of these things? Yeah.
I guess I just you're mentioning the reindustrialization of the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I really worry about the potential for increasingly versatile automation and displacing a lot of workers and preventing the creation of a new American working class.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess some options that potentially opens up, which I guess I think his name is Matt Brunig, is maybe there's a potential for people to buy into the means of production and own it that way.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, first of all, you're definitely right. And second of all, I think one way that I think about it is if the United States, were to reindustrialize, and if we were to see them lose those jobs 20 years later, because it's not to globalization, it's to automation, then I think to what you were saying earlier is we've put the crisis out in front in bright, shining letters that there's no amount of finicking with the system of production. It's a contradictory, the values themselves are contradictory. I think of the Tucker Carlson clip where he's saying, I would absolutely regulate automation. I would not let any of these jobs go. That's not the solution, but the fact that he has to clarify that is, I think, something to capitalize on.
And maybe just a more basic point is that these sort of demands on the state are really just completely foreign to the historical memory of socialism. In fact, the exact opposite, in the sense that the point really was to communicate the illegitimacy or the impossibility of the present state to succeed in maintaining the state of affairs. Mm-hmm. Sometimes one might get a concession out of it, But the point is that that concession doesn't solve the problem.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of how like Marxists, orthodox Marxists straddled the age-old line of like, well, is winning a reform advancing the struggle or not? And it's like, well, the point is, the question there is leadership. And your point is great, and I'm going to pitch, so the coffee break on Sunday that we're going to have. In our weekly email, I included an article. It's very brief. It's by Chris Catrone, who is one of the founding members of Platypus, called Robots and Sweatshops. It's like maybe 300 words. It's so short. And the basic point is that it's not that capitalism is about industrialization or the subordination of labor. It does both. And at the same time, it poses the possibilities of the emancipation of labor and the reduction of work, right? So it's like capitalism is not like the problem of robots and the problem of sweatshops. It's like robots and sweatshops, and both of those are like the same thing. Not in the sense that they're like literally the same, but they're symptomatic expressions of the same world historic crisis. So I guess the basic point is, you raise a concern about the question of industrialization. Like, yes, good, that's the point. That's capitalism. And I think I'm going to end it there. I'm happy to take questions, but I think the camera's going to die soon. So, thank you.